Welcome to today's video. I hope you're not scared. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe button, and now we can start with the scary story. Who is Jack the Ripper? Not only who was the serial killer nicknamed Jack the Ripper is still a mystery. It's also disputed how many women he actually killed. He's usually credited with 5 to 11 murders. Of these, 5 stands out so much that experts are almost certain that these are the cases in which Jack the Ripper killed. The last victim of the so-called Canonical Five was Mary Jane Kelly. She was the most disfigured by the killer. She was only recognized by her ears and eyes. When London police officers arrived at the flat where the landlord found the murdered lodger, Mary Jane Kelly, on the morning of the 9th of November 1888, they were confronted with arguably the most horrific sight of their careers. She was unrecognizable. This is despite the fact that in previous weeks, other brutally murdered women, believed to be victims of serial killer Jack the Ripper, were found on the streets of the same neighborhood. But nothing they'd seen before could compare to what the slain Mary Jane looked like. Then, when her ex-boyfriend was to make a definitive identification at the pathology department, if it hadn't been for the fact that the killer had left her eyes and ears in their original location, a recognition would have been impossible. 25-year-old Mary Jane had last been seen alive the day before, on the evening of November 8th, 1888. And on the night of the 9th of November, probably in the early hours of the morning, a man she had apparently invited into her apartment, or rather room, had not only cut her throat, but had completely mutilated her corpse. What he did to the body would be more appropriate to the word disemboweled. Although more theories about her death were later developed, most contemporaries had no doubt that the butcher was Jack the Ripper. Next, Jack the Ripper. Disgusting. Jack McCarthy sent me, body finder Thomas Bowyer told officers when he arrived at the station. That's all he could muster, because what he found in his rented apartment took all his other words. Fallen beauty. Mary Jane Kelly, however, doesn't stand out among Jack the Ripper's canonical 5 victims only in that the killer has made her the most miserable. For one thing, she was the youngest of all the women killed, and for another, she was supposedly the most beautiful. Sources disagree on the color of her hair, only that her eyes were blue. While by this time Jack the Ripper was choosing prostitutes in their 40s, Mary Jane was only 25 at the time of her death. Unlike the other murdered women, relatively little is known about her life. The stories she told about herself to those around her were partly true, partly made up, and no one has ever been able to prove which was which. Writer Hallie Rubenhold, who chronicles the lives of Jack the Ripper's victims in the 5, told Wales Online. Mary Jane said of herself that she was born in Ireland, but lived in Wales from a young age. She was also reportedly from a fairly wealthy family. During her teenage years, she apparently did not behave according to the social standards of the time, and so was hospitalized. However, the writer Rubenhold claims that it was probably not in a hospital, but in some private institution for fallen girls, particularly those who had sexual relations outside of marriage. According to other sources, she married at the age of 16, but her husband died accidentally at work 3 years later. After her dismissal, or widowhood, she embarked on a career as a prostitute, first in Cardiff, then moving to London. According to the book The Five, she arrived on the London scene about 5 years before her death, says Wales Online. In London, she thrived at first. She was more of a luxury companion than a common street prostitute. She moved around the central West End of the British capital. She lived and worked in a luxury brothel, which was apparently run by a Frenchwoman. Mary Jane kept calling herself Marie Jeanette, allegedly owned expensive clothes, and, according to what she told a friend years later, usually rode in carriages, Whitechapel Jack outlines. But then things got complicated. The pimps moved the young woman to a brothel in Paris, where Mary Jane apparently didn't like it, and after a few weeks she managed to escape back to London. But in escaping, she made a number of enemies, and life in London was never as easy for her as it had been before, said writer Rubenhold. So the beautiful, luxurious companion Mary Jane ended up in a slum, in a street not far from the docks. a place where drunken workers roamed the streets in search of more drink and sex. Perhaps it was this social downfall that caused it, but in the new neighborhood, Mary Jane also began to drink heavily. She did find a boyfriend with whom she shared a rented room at 13 Miller's Court, but this worker was not exactly enthusiastic about her career as a prostitute. He had therefore moved out a few days before the woman was killed. Nevertheless, he did not break contact with the girl, even giving her money from time to time, and the singing stopped. Exactly what the last hours of Mary Jane's life were like is unclear. She was visited by a former boyfriend and a friend between 7 and 8 p.m., but after that, witness accounts diverge. For example, her neighbor Mary Ann Cox testified that Mary Jane brought a man to her apartment before midnight, and that there was singing coming from her room. But it stopped around 12:30 at night. George Hutchinson, the laborer, in turn, said that he still saw Mary Jane outside at 2 a.m. in the company of a very well-dressed man, unusually well considering the circumstances of the neighborhood. Later on, no one saw Mary Jane alive except her murderer. On the morning of November 9th, the girl's landlord sent a subordinate to the girl's apartment to extract the rent due from Mary Jane. He found only a completely mutilated corpse in the room. He had caught a glimpse of her through the window, and even this sight was enough to make his words stick in his throat. The reason Jack the Ripper disfigured Mary Jane more than his previous victims, according to investigators at the time, was due to the location of the murder. While he had killed and butchered his previous victims on the street, where he had to hurry to avoid being caught in the act, he was in no danger of detection in Mary Jane's apartment. The pathologist's report stated that it must have taken about 2 hours to butcher the body. The only bright spot in the autopsy report, if it can be called that at all, was the information that the mutilation of the body took place post-mortem, that is, that the killer first killed the girl by slitting her throat and then set about cutting the organs out of the body. But then, the description of the corpse is so gruesome that horror filmmakers have a lot of catching up to do. Breasts cut off, intestines removed. The police didn't dare enter the room until investigators who had already examined previous Jack the Ripper victims arrived. A fire was burning in the fireplace. The girl's clothes were folded on a chair. Her shoes were in front of the fireplace. The body, laid in the middle of the bed, was naked except for a fine chemise. The head was turned to the left side, the legs wide apart, the Whitechapel Jack server describes. It was hard to believe that what was lying on the sheets was a beautiful young girl just a few hours ago. All the entrails had been cut out of her abdomen. Her breasts had been sliced off by the killer, her face cut beyond recognition. Her nose, cheeks, and eyebrows had been partially removed. The viscera were found in various places near the body. The uterus and kidneys with one breast under her head. The other breast was near her right foot, the liver between the feet. The intestines were on the right side of the body and the spleen on the left, pathologist Thomas Bond wrote in the report. Dr. Bond also states in the report that he believes the killer had no medical training. In my opinion, he did not have the technical skills of a butcher or a person who works with animal carcasses, Bond said. The public was even more horrified than in previous murders. However, despite the fact that literally all of London was looking for Jack the Ripper, he was never caught. Mary Jane was buried 10 days after his death. No relatives could be found, so only a former boyfriend, an employee of her landlord, and 4 women she was friends with accompanied her on her final journey. But the funeral procession was watched by thousands of excited Londoners. Later, investigative versions emerged that the brutality with which the prostitute was mutilated and the place where she was killed, in a flat, not on the street, were more likely to prove that the murder was committed by someone who was merely emulating Jack the Ripper. But most experts have agreed over the years that, in the case of Mary Jane, it was more likely that Jack the Ripper's rampage had indeed reached its peak. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and check out other videos on my channel. Bye.